Zephyr 9 adjusted his observation equipment one final time as his cloaked ship drifted silently through the void of space. The Hegemony Council had given him what they considered a routine assignment: watch the humans during their involvement in the Proxima conflict and report back on their military capabilities. The council members had laughed when they briefed him, calling humans primitive and emotional creatures who barely deserved to be called a spacefaring race. The alien observer had done this kind of work for over 3 centuries. He had watched the rise and fall of dozens of species, cataloged their strengths and weaknesses, and filed his reports with clinical precision. This assignment felt no different from any other. Humans were just another young species stumbling around the galaxy, playing at being warriors while the real powers decided their fate. Through his advanced sensors, Zephyr 9 could see the human fleet approaching the contested system. Their ships looked like scrap metal held together by hope and desperation. The flagship, a massive vessel called the Hughes Valiant, bore scars from previous battles. Its hull was patched with different metals, creating a patchwork appearance that made Zephyr 9 shake his head in disgust. No proper military would allow their ships to look so unprofessional. The bridge of the Valiant buzzed with activity as Admiral Jake Morrison reviewed battle plans with his officers. Zephyr 9 had studied the humans' file during his approach. Morrison was 53 years old, a veteran of several minor conflicts, and according to the intelligence reports, prone to emotional decision-making. The alien observer expected nothing impressive from such a commander. Lieutenant Katie Brooks stood at the tactical station, her voice rising as she argued with Commander Ryan Bell about engagement protocols. Zephyr 9 noted this breach of discipline in his preliminary report. In any civilized military, such public disagreement would result in immediate punishment. The fact that Admiral Morrison simply listened to both sides without intervening showed the weakness of human command structure. "We should hit them fast and hard," Brooks insisted, her hands moving frantically over her control panel. "The Vorthans expect us to follow standard fleet tactics, but we can surprise them if we come in from multiple vectors." Commander Bell crossed his arms and frowned. "That's suicide, Katie. We don't have the numbers for a direct assault. We need to play this smart, use our advantages." "What advantages?" Brooks shot back. "They outgun us 3-1, their ships are faster, and their armor is better. Our only chance is to do something they don't expect." Zephyr 9 recorded this exchange with professional interest. The humans were about to face the Vorthans, a species known throughout the galaxy for their methodical approach to warfare. The Vorthans had perfected military tactics over thousands of years, turning battle into a precise science. They would crush these arguing humans without breaking stride. Admiral Morrison finally spoke, his voice calm despite the tension around him. "Both of you make valid points. Ryan, you're right about playing smart. Katie, you're right about the element of surprise. The question is how we combine both approaches." The bridge fell silent as Morrison studied the tactical display. Zephyr 9 watched the human commander's face, noting the lines of stress around his eyes. The alien observer had seen this look before on the faces of doomed commanders throughout the galaxy. It was the expression of someone who knew they were outmatched but refused to admit it. "Here's what we're going to do," Morrison said finally. "We'll split into 3 groups. Ryan, you take the destroyers and frigates around the asteroid field. Make them think you're the main force. Katie, you take the fighters and light cruisers through the nebula. Hit their flanks when they commit to Ryan's group." "What about the Valiant?" Bell asked. Morrison smiled grimly. "We're going straight down the middle." Sometimes the best way to surprise someone is to do exactly what they expect, just better than they thought possible. Zephyr 9 made more notes about human tactical thinking. The plan was simple, perhaps even crude by galactic standards. Any competent commander would see through such an obvious maneuver. The Vorthans would position their forces to counter all 3 approaches, turning the human strategy into a disaster. The crew of the Valiant moved with purpose as they prepared for battle. Zephyr 9 watched them through his sensors, noting their casual behavior and informal communication. They called each other by first names, made jokes during serious moments, and showed none of the rigid discipline that marked professional soldiers. Engineering Chief Bobby Martinez actually started singing while he worked on the engine systems, his voice carrying through the ship's communication channels. "Bobby, keep it down over there," Morrison called out with what sounded like amusement, rather than authority. "Some of us are trying to concentrate." "Sorry, Admiral," Martinez replied, though he continued humming quietly. "The engines always work better when they're happy." Such unprofessional behavior would have resulted in court-martial in any civilized military. Zephyr 9 added this observation to his growing list of human military failures. The Hegemony Council would find his report amusing. Another example of why humans posed no threat to established galactic powers. The human fleet reached the edge of the contested system, where long-range sensors detected the Vorthan battle group waiting for them. The enemy formation was perfect, textbook positioning that would allow them to bring maximum firepower to bear while maintaining defensive integrity. The Vorthans had done this 1,000 times before against species far more advanced than humans. Zephyr-9 settled back in his observation post, ready to document what he expected would be a quick and decisive Vorthan victory. The humans would fight bravely, perhaps even impressively for such a primitive species, but they would lose. Then he would file his report, collect his payment, and move on to the next assignment. He had no idea that he was about to witness something that would change his understanding of warfare forever. The battle began exactly as Zephyr 9 expected. The Vorthan battle group moved into perfect formation, their ships arranging themselves in the classic defensive pattern that had won them victories across the galaxy. Their commander, a seasoned veteran named Thoric Prime, had studied human tactics for weeks before this engagement. He knew their weaknesses, their limited technology, and their tendency toward emotional decision-making. Admiral Morrison's voice crackled across the human fleet channels as the three groups split apart according to plan. "Remember, everyone, we're not here to win pretty. We're here to win, period. Stay loose, stay flexible, and trust your training." Zephyr 9 noted the informal tone again. No proper military commander would use such casual language during combat operations. The alien observer watched as Commander Bell led his destroyer group toward the asteroid field, their engines burning bright against the dark space. The Vorthans tracked them easily, moving ships to intercept what they correctly identified as a flanking maneuver. Lieutenant Brooks took her fighters and light cruisers toward the nebula's edge, hoping to use the gas clouds for cover. The Vorthans had anticipated this move too, positioning their fastest ships to cut off the human force before it could disappear into the colorful mists. Everything proceeded according to standard tactical doctrine. Then Admiral Morrison did something that made Zephyr 9 lean forward in his observation chair. Instead of leading the Valiant straight into the enemy formation as announced, Morrison suddenly ordered a full stop. The massive ship hung motionless in space while its escorts spread out around it like a protective shell. "What is he doing?" Zephyr 9 muttered to himself, checking his sensors to make sure he was reading the situation correctly. The Vorthans seemed equally confused. Their formation wavered slightly as Thoric Prime tried to understand why the human flagship had stopped moving. According to every military manual in the galaxy, a stopped ship was a dead ship. It became an easy target for enemy weapons while losing all tactical mobility. Morrison's voice came over the communications again, still calm despite the approaching enemy. "Bobby, how are those engines holding up?" "Running hot but steady, Admiral." Martinez replied from engineering. "Give me the word and I'll push them past the red line." "Not yet. Katie, what's your status?" Brooks' voice crackled with static from the nebula. "We're in position, sir. The Vorthans are trying to box us in, but we can break through when ready. Ryan, how about you?" Commander Bell's response came through weapons fire in the background. "Taking some hits, but we're drawing their attention. They've committed 4 ships to our position." Zephyr 9 realized what Morrison was doing. The human commander was using himself as bait, making the Vorthans think the main attack would come from the stationary flagship. It was a desperate gambit that would only work if the enemy commander was foolish enough to fall for such an obvious trap. Thoric Prime was not foolish. He recognized the deception and began repositioning his forces to counter the real threats from the asteroid field and nebula. His ships moved with practiced precision, adapting to the human strategy exactly as military doctrine demanded. That was when Captain Lisa Hayes of the U.S. Defender did something that changed everything. Her ship had taken heavy damage during the opening exchange of fire. Hull breaches vented atmosphere into space while her engines flickered and died. Any reasonable commander would have ordered an evacuation, saving the crew while abandoning the vessel. Hayes instead ordered her remaining crew to the forward sections and pointed her dying ship directly at the largest Vorthan cruiser. Defender to Admiral Morrison, Hayes' voice came through the static. We're making our final run. Tell my husband. I kept my promise. Zephyr 9 watched in shock as the damaged human ship accelerated toward the enemy vessel. The Vorthans fired everything they had at the approaching wreck, but Hayes had timed her maneuver perfectly. The Defender's hull absorbed the punishment just long enough to reach its target. The collision sent shockwaves through both fleets. The Vorthan cruiser, one of their most powerful ships, crumpled around the human vessel's remains. Secondary explosions rippled through both ships as their reactors overloaded. In seconds, 2 major warships had been reduced to expanding clouds of debris, but Hayes' sacrifice had accomplished more than just destroying one enemy ship. The collision had created a gap in the Vorthan formation, and Morrison immediately exploited it. The Valiant's engines roared to life as the flagship surged forward, its weapons blazing at the confused enemy ships. Now, Bobby, give me everything you've got. Morrison shouted over the sounds of battle. The human ship moved faster than Zephyr 9 had thought possible. Its patched hull groaned under the stress, but the engines pushed it through the gap that Hayes had created. The Vorthans tried to close ranks, but they were too slow to stop the massive ship from breaking through their defensive line. Commander, Bell's destroyers erupted from the asteroid field at the same moment, catching the Vorthans between two forces. The enemy ships found themselves fighting on multiple fronts, their perfect formation dissolving into chaos as they struggled to respond to attacks from unexpected directions. Lieutenant Brooks led her fighters out of the nebula like angry wasps, their small size allowing them to dart between the larger ships while unleashing devastating close-range attacks. The Vorthans had trained to fight other conventional fleets, not this swarm of small, fast targets that seemed to appear from nowhere. The tide of battle turned in minutes. Ships that had seemed invincible moments before now burned in the void, their crews abandoning them in escape pods. The Vorthans began a fighting retreat, their disciplined formation crumbling under the chaotic human assault. Zephyr-9 stared at his sensor readings in disbelief. The humans had not just survived the encounter, they had won. They had defeated a superior enemy through tactics that defied every rule of civilized warfare. Captain Hayes had literally thrown her ship and crew at the enemy, turning a military disaster into a strategic victory. As the last Vorthan ships fled the battlefield, Zephyr 9 began to understand that his initial assessment might have been wrong. These humans were not the primitive, emotional creatures he had expected. They were something else entirely, something that fought with a combination of desperate courage and tactical brilliance that he had never seen before. The alien observer started revising his report, but found himself struggling to find the right words to describe what he had witnessed. How could he explain to the Hegemony Council that humans treated suicide attacks as viable tactical options? How could he make them understand that emotional decision-making might actually be a strength rather than a weakness? For the first time in his long career, Zephyr 9 felt uncertain about his conclusions. The battle was over, but his real education about human warfare had just begun. The weeks following the Vorthan battle brought news that made Zephyr 9 question everything he thought he knew about warfare. The Krex Empire, one of the most feared military powers in the galaxy, had decided to enter the Proxima conflict. Their legendary silent ships were already moving toward human-controlled space, bringing with them a terror that had broken the will of countless civilizations. Zephyr 9 had studied the Krex tactics extensively during his centuries of observation work. The silent ships were technological marvels that could jam all forms of communication and sensor equipment within entire star systems. When these vessels arrived, enemy fleets found themselves blind, deaf, and isolated. Unable to coordinate their movements or even know where their allies were, most species simply surrendered rather than fight in complete darkness. The alien observer positioned his cloaked ship near the human fleet's staging area, expecting to document their inevitable retreat. Any rational commander would withdraw their forces rather than face the Krex in such hopeless conditions. Admiral Morrison, however, seemed determined to prove that humans were anything but rational. "Listen up, everyone," Morrison's voice carried across the fleet channels as the distant sensor contacts appeared on long-range scans. "The Krex are coming with their silent ships in about 6 hours. We won't be able to talk to each other, see each other, or coordinate our movements." Most species run when they hear that news. Zephyr 9 nodded approvingly. Finally, the humans were showing some sense. They would retreat to fight another day, preserving their forces for battles they could actually win. "But we're not most species," Morrison continued. "We're going to stay here and show these Krex what humans do when the lights go out." The alien observer nearly fell from his chair. The humans were planning to fight blind against one of the galaxy's most dangerous enemies. It was suicide on a scale that defied comprehension. Commander Bell's voice crackled over the communications. "Admiral, what's the plan? How do we fight when we can't see or talk to each other?" Morrison's reply was so simple that Zephyr 9 initially thought it was a joke. "We use our eyes, our voices, and our brains. Just like humans did for thousands of years before we invented all this fancy technology." The next few hours were unlike anything Zephyr 9 had ever witnessed. Instead of preparing for retreat, the human fleet began implementing the most primitive communication systems imaginable. Ships positioned themselves in visual range of each other, their crews practicing hand signals and light patterns. Some vessels even began transmitting messages using simple drum beats that could travel through the hulls of nearby ships. Lieutenant Brooks worked with her fighter squadrons to develop a series of formation patterns that could convey complex tactical information without using any electronic communication. The pilots practiced flying in tight groups, using the positions of their ships to spell out words and commands that their wing leaders could read and understand. Chief Martinez surprised everyone by suggesting they use mirrors to reflect light between ships, creating a visual communication network that could span the entire fleet. Within hours, every human vessel had crews stationed at observation posts with polished metal surfaces, ready to relay messages across the darkness. The Krex silent ships arrived exactly on schedule, their dark hulls emerging from hyperspace, like nightmares made real. As soon as they activated their jamming systems, the space around the human fleet became a dead zone. No radio signals, no sensor readings, no electronic communications of any kind could function within their area of effect. Most civilizations would have panicked at this point, their crews stumbling blindly through darkened ships while their commanders tried desperately to maintain some form of order. The humans, however, seemed to treat the situation as just another problem to solve. Zephyr 9 watched in fascination as the human fleet began moving in perfect coordination despite having no electronic communication systems. Light signals flashed between ships as crews used their improvised mirror networks to relay orders. The sound of drums echoed through space as vessels used their hulls to transmit coded messages to nearby allies. Commander Amy Foster led her fighter squadron in what should have been an impossible attack run. Without sensors or communication systems, her pilots navigated by watching the positions of their wingmates and following hand signals that somehow conveyed complex tactical information. The Krex ships, designed to fight enemies who depended on advanced technology, found themselves completely unprepared for attacks. Guided by nothing more than human eyes and intuition. The battle that followed was unlike anything in galactic military history. The humans fought with a combination of primitive communication methods and advanced weapons that created chaos in the Krex formations. Their ships moved in patterns that seemed random but were actually carefully choreographed dances of destruction. When The Krex tried to adapt their tactics. They discovered that jamming human communications was meaningless when the humans could simply shout orders to each other across the void. Ship crews opened their airlocks and used hand signals to coordinate with nearby vessels. Some pilots even flew their fighters close enough to other ships to communicate through gestures alone. The most shocking moment came when the Krex flagship tried to ram the U's Valiant. In any normal battle, such a maneuver would have been devastating. But the human crew had anticipated this possibility and prepared accordingly. Chief Martinez had rigged the ship's external lights to create a massive arrow pointing toward the weakest section of the enemy vessel's hull. Admiral Morrison saw the signal and ordered his ship to present its strongest armor toward the impact point. The collision that should have destroyed both vessels instead resulted in the Krex flagship breaking apart against the Valiant's reinforced hull. The human ship survived with heavy damage but remained functional. As the battle continued, Zephyr 9 began to understand something terrifying about human nature. They didn't just adapt to unexpected situations, they seemed to thrive in them. The loss of their advanced technology didn't weaken them. It forced them to rely on more fundamental skills that other species had forgotten. The Krex, despite their technological superiority, found themselves outmaneuvered by enemies who used drums, mirrors, and shouted commands to coordinate their attacks. Their silent ships, designed to create chaos and confusion, had instead created conditions where human ingenuity could flourish. When the last Krex vessel fled the battlefield, the human fleet began the slow process of restoring their communication systems. The crews who had fought blind for hours celebrated their victory with the same casual attitude that had initially convinced Zephyr 9 they were unprofessional. "Not bad for a bunch of primitives," Morrison's voice finally crackled over the restored communication channels. "Let's patch up our ships and see who wants to try us next." Zephyr 9 stared at his sensor readings, struggling to process what he had witnessed. The humans had defeated the Krex using methods that predated spaceflight. By thousands of years, they had taken their greatest weakness and turned it into a strength through sheer determination and adaptability. For the first time since beginning his assignment, the alien observer felt something he had never experienced before. Fear. Not fear of death or injury, but fear of what these humans might be capable of when they were truly tested. The Hegemony Council had sent him to watch a primitive species play at war, but he was beginning to suspect that humans didn't play at anything. The encrypted message that reached Zephyr 9 3 days after the Krex battle changed everything. The Hegemony Council was no longer interested in intelligence gathering about human military capabilities. Their new orders were simple and direct. The humans had become too dangerous to be allowed to continue existing. The Council wanted them eliminated before they could spread their chaotic influence throughout the galaxy. Zephyr 9 read the message twice before its full meaning sank in. The Council had made the same mistake that countless other galactic powers had made throughout history. They had seen a threat and decided to crush it before it could grow stronger. What they didn't understand was that threatening humans seemed to make them more dangerous, not less. The alien observer's new assignment was to identify human weaknesses that could be exploited in a coordinated attack by Council forces. He was to find their key leaders, their most important installations, and their critical supply lines. The information would be used to plan a strike that would end human involvement in galactic affairs permanently. As Zephyr 9 began his reconnaissance, he discovered that the humans had chosen to make their stand at Colony Station Omega, a research facility in the Outer Rim that had been converted into a defensive position. The station was home to nearly 50,000 civilians, including families of military personnel and scientists working on various projects. It was exactly the kind of target that the Council preferred, valuable enough to defend, but difficult to protect. The human fleet had positioned itself around the station, creating a defensive perimeter that looked impressive but was clearly insufficient against the forces being assembled against them. Admiral Morrison had perhaps 30 ships of various sizes, while the combined Council fleet approaching the system numbered over 200 vessels. The mathematics of the situation were brutally What made the situation even more hopeless for the humans was the nature of Colony Station Omega itself. Unlike military installations designed for warfare, the station was a civilian research facility with minimal defensive capabilities. Its inhabitants were scientists, engineers, teachers, and children. They had no military training and limited combat experience. Any rational species would have evacuated the station and retreated to more defensible positions. The humans, however, seemed determined to prove once again that they were anything but rational. Zephyr 9 watched through his sensors. As the station's civilian administrator, a middle-aged woman named Carol White organized the defense preparations. She had no military rank or combat experience, yet she coordinated the efforts of thousands of people with calm efficiency that impressed even the alien observer. "We're not soldiers," White announced over the station's communication system. "We're teachers, engineers, mechanics, and shopkeepers. But this is our home, and we're going to defend it." The transformation that followed was unlike anything Zephyr 9 had ever witnessed. The research station began changing into something that defied every principle of military engineering. Scientists repurposed atmospheric processors into weapon systems. Teachers organized children into communication networks that could relay information throughout the station. Even the cafeteria staff found ways to contribute by creating improvised, explosive devices from kitchen supplies. The alien observer noted every detail for his report, but found himself struggling to categorize what he was seeing. The humans weren't following any recognized military doctrine. They were simply taking everything available and turning it into part of their defense. Maintenance tunnels became troop movement routes. Laboratory equipment became surveillance systems. Even the station's waste recycling plant was modified to produce chemical weapons. Dr. Henry Stone, the station's chief engineer, worked around the clock to turn civilian infrastructure into military assets. He connected the station's power grid to create massive electromagnetic pulse weapons that could disable approaching ships. The artificial gravity systems were modified to create crushing forces in key corridors. Even the station's communication array was turned into a weapon that could jam enemy sensors. Zephyr 9 watched a group of teenagers led by a high school teacher named Janet Clark as they learned to operate makeshift weapon systems. These children, who should have been studying mathematics and literature, were instead calculating firing solutions and coordinating defensive positions. Their casual attitude toward the approaching battle was both inspiring and terrifying. The most shocking aspect of the human preparations was their complete lack of fear about the overwhelming odds they faced. Parents said goodbye to their children with the same calm tone they might use when leaving for work. Scientists continued their research projects even while installing weapon systems. The entire population seemed to view the coming battle as just another problem to solve rather than a life-or-death struggle. When the Council fleet finally arrived in the system, they found a situation that defied their understanding of warfare. The research station had been transformed into a fortress that bristled with improvised weapons and defensive systems. The civilian population had become a military force without losing their essential humanity. The battle began with a massive bombardment that should have destroyed the station's defenses within minutes. Instead, the humans had anticipated this attack and prepared accordingly. The station's shields, designed to protect against cosmic radiation, had been enhanced with technology stolen from destroyed enemy ships. The orbital platforms that once studied stellar phenomena now served as weapons platforms that could target capital ships. Danny Rodriguez, a cargo pilot who had been delivering supplies to the station when the siege began, volunteered for what everyone knew was a suicide mission. His ship, loaded with explosives and reactor fuel, was aimed at the Council fleet's command vessel. As he prepared for his final flight, Rodriguez recorded a message for his young daughter back on Earth. "Hey, sweetheart, Daddy has to go do something important now. I want you to remember that sometimes people have to make hard choices to protect the ones they love. Be proud of your old man, and remember that heroes aren't the people who aren't scared. Heroes are the people who are scared but do what needs to be done anyway." Zephyr 9 watched in horror as Rodriguez's ship accelerated toward the Council flagship. The enemy vessel's defensive systems opened fire, but the human pilot had planned his approach perfectly. His ship absorbed the punishment just long enough to reach its target, and the resulting explosion tore through the command ship's hull like paper. The loss of their flagship threw the Council fleet into confusion, but the humans weren't finished. The station's modified research equipment began broadcasting signals that interfered with the enemy's coordination systems. Children who had been playing video games hours earlier now operated weapon systems with deadly precision. Scientists, who had spent their careers studying peaceful phenomena, now calculated the most efficient ways to destroy enemy ships. As the battle raged around Colony Station Omega, Zephyr 9 realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. The humans weren't just defending their territory. They were defending their way of life. Every civilian who picked up a weapon, every child who helped relay communications, every scientist who turned their knowledge toward warfare was making the same choice that Danny Rodriguez had made. The alien observer began to understand that his mission to find human weaknesses was fundamentally flawed. The humans didn't have traditional military weaknesses because they didn't fight traditional military battles. They turned their entire civilization into a weapon when threatened, creating something that couldn't be defeated by conventional means. For the first time since accepting this assignment, Zephyr 9 felt genuine fear about what he was documenting. The Hegemony Council had sent him to find ways to destroy the humans, but he was beginning to suspect that the humans might be something that couldn't be destroyed. They were something that could only be awakened, and once awakened, they might destroy everything else instead. As the battle continued to rage around the research station, the alien observer began to realize that he might have made a terrible mistake by coming here. Some things were better left undisturbed, and humanity might be one of them. The months following the Colony Station Omega siege brought Zephyr 9 to a terrifying realization about the nature of human warfare. As he continued his observations, moving from battle to battle across the expanding conflict zone, he began to understand that what he had witnessed wasn't just tactical brilliance or desperate courage. It was something far more fundamental and disturbing. The alien observer found himself studying human history through intercepted data transmissions and captured records. What he discovered made his blood run cold in ways he had never experienced before. Humans had been fighting wars for their entire existence as a species. Not just occasional conflicts like other civilizations, but constant, unending warfare that had shaped every aspect of their development. Their planet Earth had never known true peace. While other species evolved during periods of stability and cooperation, humans had been forged in the fires of perpetual conflict. Every advancement in their technology, every development in their social structures, every aspect of their culture had been influenced by the need to survive against other humans who were trying to kill them. Zephyr 9 watched the defense of New California, a mining world that had become the latest target in the expanding war. The human forces there were led by Colonel Steve Adams, a career soldier who had spent his entire adult life fighting various enemies across the galaxy. What made Adams dangerous wasn't his experience or his tactical knowledge, but the way he saw the entire planet as a weapon waiting to be used. "We're not just defending this world," Adams explained to his staff during a planning meeting that Zephyr 9 observed through his sensors. "We're turning it into the biggest gun in human space. Every mine, every processing plant, every piece of equipment on this planet is going to be part of our defense." The alien observer watched in fascination as the humans began implementing their plan. Mining lasers designed to cut through solid rock were repositioned to target enemy ships. Ore processing facilities were converted into massive ammunition factories. Even the planet's weather control systems were modified to create artificial storms that could confuse enemy sensors and disrupt landing operations. Engineer Lavra Kim, a young woman who had been working on civilian projects just months before, found herself designing weapon systems that defied conventional military thinking. When asked how she knew her modifications would work, she simply shrugged and said, It seemed like it should. This casual approach to deadly innovation terrified Zephyr 9 more than any advanced weapon system he had ever encountered. The humans didn't just use their technology as weapons. They used their entire environment. The planet's geological features became part of their defensive strategy. Underground tunnel systems originally designed for mining were converted into troop movement networks that allowed human forces to appear anywhere on the planet's surface without warning. Natural cave systems became hidden bases where supplies and reinforcements could be stored indefinitely. When the enemy fleet arrived to attack New California, they found themselves facing something that no military academy in the galaxy had prepared them for. The humans had turned an entire world into a single, massive weapon system. Every mountain, every valley, every river and forest had been modified to serve their defensive needs. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. The attacking forces found themselves fighting not just human soldiers, but the planet itself. Mining charges buried in strategic locations created artificial earthquakes that could destroy entire enemy formations. Weather control systems generated lightning storms that could disable enemy equipment and kill exposed troops. Zephyr 9 watched one particularly disturbing incident, where a group of enemy soldiers took shelter in what appeared to be an abandoned mining facility. The humans had anticipated this move and had filled the building with industrial gases that were normally used for ore processing. The enemy troops died without ever seeing their attackers, killed by the very air they breathed. As the battle continued, the alien observer began to understand the true horror of what he was witnessing. The humans weren't just fighting a war. They were demonstrating their mastery of warfare itself. Every tactic they used, every weapon they deployed, every strategic decision they made showed the influence of millions of years of evolutionary pressure that had shaped them into the perfect killing machines. The most disturbing aspect of human warfare wasn't their technology or their tactics, but their attitude toward the entire process. They approached the business of killing with the same casual efficiency that other species used for peaceful activities. War wasn't an aberration for humans, it was their natural state. Peace was just the time they used to prepare for the next conflict. Colonel Adams proved this point during the final phase of the battle when he ordered his forces to pursue the retreating enemy fleet. Most species would have been content to defend their territory successfully, but the humans saw victory as just another opportunity to inflict more damage on their opponents. "We're not done yet," Adams announced over the communication channels. "These people came here to kill us, and they need to understand that there are consequences for that kind of behavior." The pursuing human forces caught up with the enemy fleet at the edge of the star system and destroyed it completely. No prisoners were taken, no mercy was shown. The humans had decided that their enemies represented a threat that needed to be eliminated, and they had acted accordingly. Zephyr 9 realized that he was witnessing something that the Hegemony Council had never anticipated. The humans weren't just another species that could be defeated through superior technology and tactics. They were something that had been specifically designed by evolution to excel at the business of war. Every aspect of human biology seemed optimized for conflict. Their ability to function under extreme stress, their capacity for rapid adaptation, their willingness to sacrifice individuals for the benefit of the group. Their talent for improvisation and innovation under pressure, all of these traits, had been developed through countless generations of warfare. The alien observer began to understand that the Council's plan to eliminate the humans was fundamentally flawed. They were trying to defeat a species that had spent millions of years learning how to win wars against opponents who were just as intelligent, just as determined, and just as ruthless as they were. The humans had already faced every possible military challenge during their evolution, and they had survived all of them. As Zephyr 9 prepared his report on the Battle of New California, he found himself struggling to find words that could adequately describe what he had witnessed. How could he explain to the Council that humans didn't just wage war, but that they were war itself given physical form? How could he make them understand that attacking humanity might be the worst mistake in galactic history? The alien observer stared at his communication equipment, knowing that he needed to send his report but dreading the response it would receive. The Council would see his warnings as cowardice or incompetence. They would assume that he had been somehow influenced by human propaganda, or that he had lost his objectivity, but Zephyr 9 knew the truth. He had seen what humans were capable of when they were truly threatened, and he understood that the galaxy was about to learn a lesson that might cost billions of lives. The humans weren't just another species that could be conquered or controlled. They were something that should have been left alone, something that was better as an ally than as an enemy. As he began composing his final report, the alien observer realized that his mission had changed from intelligence gathering to damage control. He wasn't just documenting human military capabilities anymore. He was trying to prevent a catastrophe that could reshape the entire galaxy. The final battle began at the Hegemony Council's own capital system, where their massive fleet had assembled to end the human threat once and for all. Zephyr 9 had sent his warnings, his desperate pleas for the Council to reconsider their decision. But his reports had been dismissed as the ravings of an observer who had lost his objectivity. The Council believed that their superior numbers and advanced technology would easily crush the human forces. Admiral Morrison arrived with what remained of the human fleet, barely 200 ships against the Council's force of over 1,000 vessels. The mathematical impossibility of human victory seemed so obvious that several Council members had traveled to the capital system to witness the destruction of humanity firsthand. They expected to watch a quick, decisive battle that would serve as a warning to other species who might consider challenging galactic authority. Zephyr 9 positioned his cloaked ship at a safe distance, knowing that he was about to witness either the end of humanity or something far worse. His sensor readings showed the human fleet approaching the massive defensive formation that surrounded the Council's homeworld. The enemy ships were arranged in perfect military formation, their weapons powered and their shields at maximum strength. The humans looked pathetic by comparison. Their ships still bore the scars of previous battles, their hulls patched with salvaged materials and their crews exhausted from months of constant warfare. Admiral Morrison's flagship, the battered used Valiant, seemed almost insignificant compared to the massive Council dreadnoughts that waited for them. "All ships, this is Admiral Morrison," the human commander's voice crackled across the communication channels. "Today we're not just fighting for our colonies or our territories. We're fighting for the right to exist as a free species in this galaxy. The Council thinks they can destroy us because we're different, because we don't follow their rules or accept their authority." The alien observer listened to Morrison's words with growing dread. The human commander wasn't giving a desperate speech before a final battle. He was making a declaration of war against the entire established order of galactic civilization. "They're about to learn what happens when you try to cage a species that was born free," Morrison continued. "They're about to discover why humans have never been conquered by anyone, including ourselves. All ships, execute Operation Nightmare." Zephyr 9 had no idea what Operation Nightmare involved, but the name alone filled him with terror. The humans had chosen that designation for their final battle plan, and given what he had witnessed during his observations, he suspected that the name was entirely appropriate. The human fleet suddenly dispersed in all directions, abandoning any pretense of traditional military formation. Individual ships began moving in seemingly random patterns that made no tactical sense according to conventional military doctrine. The Council fleet tried to maintain their defensive positions, but found themselves unable to predict where the humans would strike next. Captain Rick Turner led a squadron of damaged destroyers straight into the heart of the enemy formation in what appeared to be a suicide attack. The Council ships concentrated their fire on his vessels, expecting to destroy them easily. Instead, Turner's ships began exploding in carefully timed sequence, creating a chain reaction that disabled the enemy's forward defensive line. The explosions weren't random acts of desperation. They were precisely calculated to create maximum damage to the Council fleet while clearing a path for the main human force. Turner had turned his own ships into guided weapons, sacrificing himself and his crews to give the rest of the human fleet a chance at victory. Commander Beth Rodriguez exploited the gap that Turner had created, leading her forces through the confused enemy lines in a maneuver that should have been impossible. Her ships moved with perfect coordination despite having no apparent communication with each other, striking at critical targets with surgical precision. The Council fleet, designed to fight conventional battles against predictable enemies, found themselves completely unprepared for the chaos that the humans had unleashed. Their formations crumbled as individual ships tried to respond to attacks that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Zephyr 9 watched in horror as the tide of battle turned in favor of the humans. The Council's numerical advantage meant nothing. When their ships couldn't coordinate their attacks or defend against enemies who fought with tactics that defied all military logic. The human fleet, smaller and more damaged, was systematically destroying a force that should have been able to crush them without effort. The most terrifying aspect of the battle was the casual efficiency with which the humans conducted their assault. They weren't fighting with desperate courage or brilliant tactics. They were simply doing what came naturally to them. War was their element, violence was their language, and destruction was their art form. As the last Council ships fled the battlefield, Zephyr 9 began composing his final report. His words would serve as both a warning and an epitaph for the civilization that had been foolish enough to challenge humanity. "We sent them to fight our enemies, and they won," he wrote. "We sent our enemies to fight them, and they lost. We sent ourselves to fight them, and we learned the truth. Humanity doesn't just wage war. They are war itself given physical form. They don't conquer territories or resources. They conquer the very concept of defeat." The alien observer paused in his writing, staring at the debris field that had once been the Hegemony Council's greatest fleet. The humans had done more than win a battle. They had shattered the illusion that any species could control or contain them. "I was sent to watch humans at war," Zephyr 9 continued his report. "Now I regret ever going. Some things in this galaxy should remain sleeping, and humanity was one of them. We awakened something that had been content to remain in its corner of space, and now it will remake the galaxy in its own image." The alien observer sealed his report and prepared to transmit it to what remained of the Council leadership. They would need to understand what they had unleashed, even if it was too late to stop it. The humans had been pushed too far, and they had responded the only way they knew how, by destroying everything that threatened them. As Zephyr 9 activated his ship's hyperdrive engines, preparing to flee to the outer rim of the galaxy, he realized that his career as an observer was over. There would be no more civilizations to study, no more species to catalog, no more reports to file. The humans had won, and they would reshape the galaxy according to their own violent nature. The alien observer had learned the truth about humanity, and that knowledge would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had seen what happened when a species evolved for war encountered a galaxy that had grown soft and complacent. The result was not conquest or domination, but something far worse, the complete transformation of galactic civilization into something that resembled humanity itself. Zephyr 9 set course for the darkest corner of space he could find, hoping to hide from the new reality that humanity would create. He had been sent to watch humans at war, and he had learned that some things were better left unwatched. The galaxy would never be the same again, and he would spend the rest of his existence regretting his role in awakening the sleeping giant that was humanity.